Hi, this is Anthony. Welcome back to my show. This video is about titanium particles on the tie. Please stick with it through the introduction. When looking at the D.B. Cooper case, there are two components, facts or evidence, and then interpretation. You would think that facts were easy enough. You would think that facts are something we could all agree on, but that's not always the case, even though we don't realize it. But if we get the facts wrong, if we misinterpret what the fact actually is, then our interpretation of it as a clue will become distorted and likely will not be accurate. Even the name D.B. Cooper is an incorrect fact. The name that the hijacker put down on the ticket was Dan Cooper, but in the immediate aftermath of the skyjacking, police in Portland, Oregon went to talk to a local ex-con named D.B. Cooper on the off chance that it might be that person. Evidently, that person was sitting in his residence, watching his television, and the police were satisfied that the individual was, in fact, not in any way connected with the skyjacking. However, a local reporter, in his haste to file a story, used the name of the person ruled out as a suspect, that is D.B. Cooper, instead of the actual suspect's assumed pseudonym, which was Dan Cooper. I think that everybody who researches the story, even if you just scratch the surface, knows that Dan Cooper was the name written on the airline ticket. So that's the fact, Dan Cooper. What's the interpretation? Most people would say that the skyjacker gave a fake name. His name was definitely not Dan Cooper. Now that's obviously an interpretation, but I agree with it. And then what is interesting is that you find possible suspects that may have gone to high school with a guy named Dan Cooper, or they may have seen a comic book about a paratrooper named Dan Cooper. But there are still other researchers or people who have written books who claim that the skyjacker was somebody from their family, and their family name was Cooper. And they're convinced that the skyjacker's real name was Cooper. So my point is, even if everyone can agree on what a fact is, which is not a given, that's where interpretations diverge. Now, I could give a lot of examples just on the D.B. Cooper case on this, but I want to focus on the issue of the titanium particles on the tie. And again, as I point out, the whole reason why people are looking at the D.B. Cooper case is we love unsolved mysteries. The point of this research and study should be to arrive at the identity of the skyjacker. And until we have DNA evidence that conclusively solves the case, there's going to be a lot of different theories and interpretations by people, and sometimes people can become very partisan along different lines. When we agree or when we disagree with somebody else's, it's easy to attack them, not just their facts or interpretations. I want to remind everyone that people who publish their research, and most people publishing books on the subject, are sincere in what they're presenting and trying to make a vital contribution to this field of study. While I encourage comments and critiques of my own work and on others, let's be civil towards each other. Even if you disagree with me, or with David Kay, or with Eric Ulis, or Ralph Himmelsbach, or anyone else, let's just all be polite. Again, we're looking for the truth. We're not looking to one-up somebody else or show that somebody else is stupid just because they've made a mistake either on facts or in their interpretation of the facts. So, what are the facts about the titanium on the clip-on tie that was left behind by the skyjacker on Northwest Orient Flight 305 the day before Thanksgiving 1971? Prominent Cooper researcher Eric Ulis has recently revealed to the media and the rest of the world that research that was actually done about 10 years ago by David Kay, who runs a group called Citizen Sleuths, was able to analyze 100,000 particles retrieved from the clip-on tie and has, among other substances, found 3 particles of titanium. Of course, these days, in 2022, titanium is found in all kinds of common items, but we have to remember that the setting for the tie was up to 1971. Here's what a recent article describing Mr. Ulis's announcement said, and I will have the links to this and other things in the show notes. I encourage you to look at various sources and hopefully go back to original sources, if you're able to, when you're analyzing an interpretation on this or anything else in the world. Ulis's evidence comes from a scientific report that was produced 10 years ago by a team that the FBI invited to analyze evidence in the cold case. That team, headed by researcher Tom Kay, lifted more than 100,000 particles off D.B. Cooper's necktie. The skyjacker is believed to have discarded the tie on seat 18E of the aircraft before he leapt from Northwest Orient Airlines jet with parachutes and $200,000 ransom. Ulis noticed in lab reports that among the tens of thousands of particles on Cooper's tie were 3 specks of an alloy made of titanium and antimony, both earth elements. When he researched this alloy, he found a Pennsylvania metals manufacturer applied for a patent to produce a titanium antimony alloy in 1957. I've been looking for something that I would call a tantamount to commercial DNA, the idea being that just as human DNA points to a specific individual, commercial DNA close to a specific company. And indeed, I actually found 3 particles of a very unique and very rare alloy, says Ulis. Records show that a company called Rem Crew, based in Midland, Pennsylvania, manufactured titanium antimony. In follow-up research and interviews, Ulis said that he learned the company never actually sold the product to the aerospace industry. He believes that because it had such limited distribution, the titanium antimony on Cooper's tie is strong evidence that the skyjacker worked at Rem Crew at some point. I've managed to isolate one person in particular, one person of interest in particular that I'm looking into that appears to check several of the boxes. I'm not releasing the person's name publicly for obvious reasons, but I'm going to continue looking into him, Ulis said. And then I think everyone knows that subsequent to this, Ulis released the name of his suspect, which is Vince Peterson. Okay, so there we have it. It was a titanium alloy, an alloy of titanium and antimony. And using that fact, he believes that there was only one place based on this patent application that had any of this substance, and he tracked down that place and located people who worked in that facility, presumably in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Oh, but is it a fact that the titanium was an alloy? Because in some news reporting, it was reported as pure titanium, and pure titanium, by definition, is not an alloy. Let's look at the website from Citizen Sleuths, which of course is run by David Kay. It even has his name at the bottom of their page. What do they say about the titanium that they themselves found on the tie? Fact: microscopic metallic titanium pieces were found on Cooper's tie. Fact: in 1971, titanium was a strategic metal primarily used in military aircraft, some civilian aircraft, and highly corrosive industrial plants. Metallic titanium was not found in consumer products at that time. Fact: all titanium used in aircraft is alloyed, and the Cooper material was pure titanium. Interpretation: due to the lack of alloy titanium, Cooper did not work in the aircraft industry. Okay, there's the smoking gun, or is it perhaps the smokeless gun? The premise that is currently being proposed is that the titanium found on the tie was an alloy of titanium and antimony. And here we have for the actual person who did the research on his own website stating that the titanium found was pure titanium. So you can't have it both ways. If there's only 3 particles of titanium, and they were pure titanium, not an alloy specific to one lab in Pennsylvania, then the whole premise of identifying Vince Peterson falls apart. So, as you let that sink in, especially if you're one of the people that left condescending messages in the comments section on my other videos, let's continue with a few other things from the website. Fact: spiral chips of aluminum and other exotic metals like bismuth and stainless steel were found on the tie. Fact: spiral aluminum chips of the type found on the tie are made in metal fabrication plants that use lathes and drill presses. Interpretation: Cooper worked in or had access to an exotic metal fabrication facility that contained titanium, aluminum, and other specialty metals. Fact: in 1971, only engineers and managers in fabrication plants wore ties to work. Interpretation: Cooper was either a manager or an engineer. Further interpretation: Cooper's knowledge of the workings of the airplane, the use of the parachute, and the construction of a bomb consists that he may have been an engineer. Back at the beginning, I talked about problems with people just agreeing on the facts much less interpretations. For instance, it's given as a fact that in 1971 only engineers and managers in fabrication plants wore ties to work. And then the interpretation is Cooper was either a manager or an engineer. Now, I don't dispute if you went out onto the shop floor in 1971 that most of the people that might be working with milling machinery on the shop floor would not be wearing ties. And I agree, and we've all seen pictures of this if you go online, that managers and engineers generally wore ties at the time. So what would seem to confirm the interpretation that Mr. K is making here on the Citizen Sleuth website. But the words that are used is that, quote, Cooper was either a manager or an engineer, unquote. It doesn't say that he possibly could have been. It says that he was, which means that it's a fact. One thing that I thought was strange was that out of 100,000 particles of various types, that there were only 3 particles of titanium, whether it was pure titanium or an alloy. It would seem to me that if you're an engineer working with titanium in what could be a fairly small lab, since it's proposed that there were only 8 people working in it, that you would have over time picked up more than 3 particles of titanium. In fact, it almost seems like the fact that there were only 3 particles detected, that would rule out somebody who was an engineer or manager in the lab, because those people should have a lot more titanium embedded in their tie. But again, that's my interpretation based on the facts I know that have been reported from people who did the analysis of the particles on the tie, and then the facts and interpretations that they have publicly posted on their website. And let's say that, whether it's pure titanium or an alloy, and that the tie belonged to Cooper, is there any other explanation that would account for him getting 3 particles of titanium out of 100,000 particles of other substances identified? As I point out in a number of my other videos, the hijacker could well have been some type of inspector who not only went to labs that had titanium, even titanium alloys, but other high-tech and aerospace manufacturing facilities, which would account for the other elements and metals found on the tie. It's also pointed out that there were a number of biological spores found on the tie, which the interpretation was that they could have come from a pharmaceutical manufacturer. Certainly, if Cooper was some type of safety inspector going to various facilities, he might also visit pharmaceutical companies. However, I did have one kind viewer write to me and say that those particular types of spores were actually used as a testing method concerning the size of oil molecules in some high-tech, so that would be in line with some type of high-tech manufacturer. And one last thing that I want to say about this that has struck me. When asked about why he was hijacking the plane, Cooper told the stewardess that he had a grudge, but not a grudge against her airline. Now, many people from all walks of life and backgrounds can have a grudge, and most of them don't hijack planes because of it. But evidently Cooper did. And there are certainly lots of suspects that I've not dealt with here, but I have on other videos, and everyone knows them, that have had military backgrounds, criminal backgrounds, and therefore may have been said to have had a grudge. If my potential hypothetical theory of Cooper possibly being some type of government employed inspector, like a safety inspector or OSHA inspector or whatever, and I'm not necessarily arguing that this is the solution, but I think that it's a realistic possibility, then would it be a stretch of the imagination to think that this perhaps low-paid government worker might have some grudge against the government, for instance? Maybe he served in the military, came back, wasn't welcomed like he expected, didn't get the career that he had wanted, and ended up working as an inspector for a state or federal government agency. I could see it. If he was in the military, he might have some, but not necessarily a lot of parachuting experience. He works for the government, he's got a grudge. As an inspector, he's traveled around to a variety of high-tech or manufacturing companies, accounting for the various substances found on his tie. And perhaps he ended up divorced, maybe deep in debt, and decided to take the week of Thanksgiving off and try to make a quick buck hijacking a plane. With the titanium tie theory that's been proposed, and Vince Peterson identified as the person most likely to be Cooper, what's his background? other than working perhaps in a lab associated with certain titanium alloys, which may or may not even be the case, and other than slightly looking like Cooper, other than having a lot more hair and parting it on the opposite side that Cooper's hair was parted on, what else in Peterson's background indicates that he had the motive and means of carrying out such an endeavor? Did he have any military, and in particular paratrooping experience? Even if there were some economic issues with his company in 1971, which I've not seen evidence that there was, but let's say that he was temporarily furloughed or laid off, and then later on came back to the company, even assuming something like that happened, which is more likely, that he would go down to the unemployment office or that he would hijack a plane with a bomb. Did Vince Peterson have any type of criminal background? When people commit big crimes, they typically start out committing smaller crimes. I've seen Peterson's son interviewed in print. He said that as far as he knew, his father was an honest guy and didn't think that his father was D.B. Cooper. Now, Peterson was almost or about 50 years old at the time of the hijacking, based on what I've read. And the hijacking was just over 51 years ago. He's now deceased, otherwise he'd be 100 or so. However, it does seem that his son is alive, and let's assume that Peterson had that son when he was 25 years old. And this example works if he was 20 or if he was 30 when he had his son. But let's say that Peterson was 25 years old when he had his son, which means that his son would be 25 years old at the time of the skyjacking, because Vince Peterson was 50 years old at the time. The skyjacking took place the night before Thanksgiving 1971. Has anybody asked the son, do you recall that your father was gone for Thanksgiving 1971? Do you even recall if your father was laid off from his job at that time? And again, let's remember that the family lived in Pennsylvania on the east coast of the United States, and the skyjacking took place in the Pacific Northwest, 4 time zones away. It's not like Peterson could have knocked over a closed liquor store in Maryland on the morning of Thanksgiving and then still made it home by dinner time at 6 p.m. in Pennsylvania. And hopefully somebody's thought to get a DNA sample from Peterson's son, just in case DNA is found on the tie, to see if there's any connection. Okay, this video has gotten a lot longer than I had expected, and there's still a lot more that I want to talk about concerning the issue of the titanium, but I'm going to save that for another video. I'll wrap it up here now. If you made it this far, I do appreciate you sticking with it, and I would love to hear from you. What are your thoughts on this? As I end here, please subscribe and continue clicking the like button and leaving those comments. I really do appreciate them. Thanks so much.